Hi folks, David Jameson here, editor of conta.co.uk. I'm very glad to be joined today by Gerry Carroll, MLA for West Belfast, a member of the Parliament in Northern Ireland, who some of you may have seen made an excellent speech in that Parliament just last week. During rioting that broke out in Northern Ireland. And you made a very strong case, Gerry, for class unity in the face of this situation. Thanks very much for coming on, first of all. Could you fill us in on what the real backdrop is to the situation in Northern Ireland? I think there's a lot of disinformation in the press this side of the Irish Sea. So could you just tell us, first of all, what's the real backdrop to what's going on right now in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I suppose where do you start? I mean, obviously, I don't know how it's been reported in Scotland, but even here in the south of Ireland as well, it's kind of reported as what's happened recently is down to the protocol being implemented by the British government, or it's down to a response to Sinn Féin ministers essentially not being prosecuted for allegedly breaching COVID rules and attending a funeral of one of their former members. And in part, some of those reasons are true, but it's much deeper in terms of why there's essentially loyalist orchestrated demonstrations and in some cases violence. And I think the reasons are, I mean, for weeks and months now, we've seen unionist MLAs and MPs in Stormont and Westminster basically stoking up the fire, stoking up the rhetoric, and really, I mean, it's quite shocking. We had Sammy Wilson, MP for the DUP, saying there should be guerrilla warfare to take on the protocol. Obviously, people will know what that means, and it has a certain connotation when a unionist MP sort of says that in reference to people who are, connected to or in loyalist paramilitaries. And really, I think part of the problem, or part of the issue, which hasn't really been discussed at the heart of why there's been so much widespread trouble, is that there's deep anger in working class communities, against parties in the executive generally. But when you talk about those working class loyalist or working class Protestant areas, there's deep anger around the DUP. In part, that's down to the fact that they're seen to have, sold out, if you will, on the question of the protocol and the deal around Brexit. In part, there's a narrative being pushed that the police treat unionists differently than everybody else in the north, which factually is not correct. When you look through the pandemic, the handling of the pandemic in the north by the executive has been quite abysmal, and the people who were more likely to be fined are people of Black and Asian minority ethnic communities, working class communities across the board. But there's been an argument being pursued by Unionism in particular that there's alienation, using these exact words. There's alienation, people feel excluded. And that's obviously, there's a working class anger to some of that, but the DUP are trying to use it for their own ends. And by that, I mean, the union is obviously under massive pressure. It's being questioned. It's being challenged in some ways by Brexit. People who normally would have been opponents of United Ireland are sort of looking to it as a possibility in the here and now, and that's challenged the DUPs and the sort of consensus of maintaining the union for 100 years now, this anniversary. There's also the issue of the DUP in particular are quite concerned about losing seats. A recent poll showed that they're likely to lose many seats in the next Assembly elections next year to the hard right TUV and to their left, if you will, from the more liberal Alliance Party, kind of similar to the Lib Dems in the north. So for all these reasons, I think unionism feels under pressure. The DUP feels under pressure, and that's being kind of whipped up. This being fed in together, and there's been a direct role in terms of unionist politicians and parties whipping up the tension, whipping up the rhetoric, in a bid to try and protect their own interests, protect the union, and there's a convergence of loyalist paramilitaries being involved in pushing, directing, cajoling, whatever word you want to use, young people without a lot of hope, without a lot of prospects, to engage in reckless rioting, which only really reinforces the power of the likes of the DUP, because the narrative therefore becomes, let's stick with our community, let's stick with our community representatives against the other side, who they are rioting against, rather than seeing that the commonality being in working class people coming together and uniting together against the DUP, but also all the executive parties and ministers. So maybe that's a quick snapshot of broadly what's going on. But within the middle of that, we're calling for working class unity. So we're obviously conscious of the role played by unionism and stoking a lot of this tension up, and the role of paramilitaries as well. But within that, it's not good enough from our perspective to simply go along with what other parties in the executive are calling for, which is a law and order response, which means working class kids being attacked with water cannons, being shot at with rubber bullets. That's obviously not only unfair and cruel, but lets off the role played by the mainstream parties in whipping up this tension, their acceptance, and in some cases working alongside paramilitaries. And the only response from our end is a unity from below to bring working class people together. As difficult as that can be to articulate in the last few weeks, but it's something that is important and essential, we think, for going forward. And you've seen some examples of it when the Thursday, the day after the main riots, if you will, were seen in Lanark Way in West Belfast. We saw bus drivers walking out in protest against one of their colleagues being attacked with a petrol bomb on his bus. So as difficult as it is, as tense as it's been, and it has been very tense and difficult, there's also opportunities for unity, and we're certainly doing what we can from a Stormont and a council and a grassroots perspective to push for that unity as much as we can.
A couple of points I wanted to pick up there on what you were talking about. One being the continued existence of loyalist gangs in some areas, and it looked from the way that the riots spread across Northern Ireland that there was some planning or instigation, as you say, and a lot of people have commented on that. And the other is the alienation that you talk about in working class communities, from various sides. It's not it's that's not only on a kind of unionist or Republican or nationalist or whatever basis. And it's interesting to me because one of the last times British politics really paid attention to Northern Ireland was what now feels like a lifetime ago, and I can barely remember it, the Good Friday Agreement. And there was a feeling that the Good Friday Agreement had put all these issues to bed. But it kind of seems like, in a sense, it's institutionalized, some of these problems. I don't know how many people in Scotland and Britain know, for example, that a lot of these gangs are also often sort of people providing kind of community services and stuff, and they have close relationships with the parties sitting in the parliament, and also that there's a sense that quite a lot of the communities, some of which were the most scarred during the Troubles, are also the communities which have been left behind economically and socially and left underrepresented ever since the Good Friday Agreement. Is that the case, and is that part of this backdrop?
It is. I thought you were going to say, David, the last time people in Britain paid attention to the North was when the DUP were kingmakers in the coalition government, because when that happened, everybody was like, what the hell, who are these DUP? And you're like, yeah, we've been dealing with them for some time. But there's a lot of truth in what to say. Obviously, in terms of sort of the Good Friday Agreement and sectarianism and division, after 1988, more peace walls went up. The figures shot up, so with more peace walls in Belfast in a quote time of peace, which is obviously a real contradiction or oxymoron. And there is real anger. I mean, people were promised a peace dividend, and it is the case that some people have done quite well out of peace. Sort of a new or a rising middle class. Belfast has the third highest proportion of multi-millionaires per UK cities. It's London, or certainly was several years ago. I don't know if it's changed. London, Aberdeen, and then Belfast. So Belfast is a city like Glasgow, like Edinburgh, of a lot of poverty, of a lot of inequality, but also a lot of wealthy people per head of population as well. And there's a real sense that working class communities have been left behind. They've been ignored. I mean, child poverty in the last 4 years has shot up by 6%, directly as a result of the welfare reform implemented by Sinn Féin and the DUP and some others as well. So there is a real sense of anger. There's a sense of people being left behind. That's true. Wages haven't really increased at all. But the problem is that uh, the unionist parties have only really talked about poverty in the last few weeks in a real cynical kind of way, and only really talk about it when they're under pressure and when it suits their interests. The DUP were in bed with the Tories, voted with the Tories pretty much all the way, voted against free school meals and a range of other issues which would have obviously addressed poverty in their own communities, if you will, and in sort of working class nationalist communities in the north as well. So there is a real sense of people have been left behind, a real sense of alienation. That's true, but the DUP have no interest or no answers to those problems. Loyalist paramilitaries certainly have no interest in solving those problems. They want to maintain their grip that they have on communities, and they rule by fear. And people are obviously terrified of them as much as they are opposed to their actions. So the task for us, I mean, people before profit and the left and trade unions and radicals, is to say, listen, you have a right to be angry. You should be angry if you're living in the Shankill, if you're living in the Falls. But look at the only time that people's conditions improved in the north, never mind anywhere else, historically and recently. And that's been when people have got organised. That's when people have been pushing back against the ministers and the executive, have been putting demands on them, have been putting them under pressure. So that's, broadly speaking, what we're trying to get across. To relate to the anger, say people should be angry, but they shouldn't be angry at their neighbour over the peace wall, because they're living in, depending on where they are, similar or worse conditions than you. And the only thing that's going to work is people coming together. So, like I said, that isn't always easy in the middle of riots when people are throwing petrol bombs at each other and throwing bricks over walls and through peace lines and peace gates that have been kicked down. But I think that's the real political message that we have been trying to and have been, I think, pushing in the last few weeks, which really cuts against the grain of what storming parties have been doing, because occasionally they might recognise that there's poverty, but they have played a direct role in not only not addressing poverty but implementing policies which have seen working class communities forced into worse levels of poverty, greater levels of food banks, and part of that has been their disastrous COVID response as well, which has made people feel more under pressure in a global pandemic where the executive should have had people's backs. They let people by the wayside.
You've covered that the how Brexit is part of how this is all been triggered, and in I think a lot of the discussion in Britain, it's turned into this is only about Brexit. How could the current reckless political class blow apart the wonderful liberal victories of Tony Blair and so on in 1997, and it's been treated in that somewhat inward looking and trite way. But as you've laid out, Brexit is a part of it. Seems to me that that when you have a state like Northern Ireland, which is because it's 100 years, of course, since the partition of Ireland and the creation of the state. It is, of course, a very artificial entity. It was designed with very artificial borders in mind. It's as you've pointed out with the peace walls, it's ended up with a lot of quite artificial internal divisions within communities, between streets and so on. And those divisions become sort of highly symbolic. And any constitutional change like Brexit, anything that comes along, any economic or social development of that kind that threatens to rearrange those borders, threatens to reignite tensions and violence and those sorts of divisions, and reinforce those sorts of divisions in society. I mean, is it time for people in Britain to remember that history and remember the very odd thing that was done, just across the sea? And what's the remedy to that? What's the remedy to what is still a fundamentally quite irrational political unit in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, well, that's the key question, I suppose. And Brexit has kind of, this isn't, as you kind of suggested, the recent riots is not all about Brexit, but it's in part sort of influenced, cause motivated, whatever term you want to use by it, in the sense of the protocol in particular. And I think the point that has to be remembered is that the DUP could have had fundamentally any Brexit that they wanted, which could have kept the integrity of the UK, if you want to use their terminology. But they didn't. They wanted a sort of a Boris Johnson style, Brexit, and they're paying the price of that. So that's the irony of ironies, I suppose. But in terms of the nature of the North and the Northern state, I mean, it is, you know, it is quite, I was going to say unique, but I suppose there are examples of partition and reaction and all that. But it's presented as being, a unique solution to a problem of two warring tribes that never got along, and good old Britain, Imperial Britain, stepped in and sorted out and fixed the problems for the natives. Right, that's kind of quite a uh, maybe facetious or simplification, but that's often how it's presented. Even in some cases in the north as well. But for our project, in terms of people before profit and what we're engaged in, we see partition and the division of Ireland as being part of a counter revolution, which was aimed at stopping the revolutionary tide which swept across Ireland, from 1916 and onwards, if you will. Maybe before that with the double lockout of 1913. And Britain obviously did not want to lose its oldest colony, and wanted to maintain obviously all 32 counties. But when it became apparent that that wasn't possible, the partition of Ireland was proposed and suggested with the support of Carson and other leading unionists. So for us, it's really that's an important debate. We're having a discussion in a conference this weekend, going through the historical reasons and the reason why partition was wrong and was a reactionary move. Not just for Catholics in terms of sectarianism and repression and all that, but also for working class Protestants as well, many of whom were actually expelled from shipyards in Belfast in the aftermath of partition. They were called rotten prods. They were radicals, socialist and communist Protestants and trade unionists who were kicked out of shipyards because they weren't deemed to be loyal enough to king and country. So there's a rich history of people kind of resisting that. But today, I suppose the main point is that Brexit, the COVID response, in many parts we are still dictated to by London, either directly or indirectly. By saying we can't do X, Y, and Z because London has control over so many policy decisions, or by the default position in many cases of Stormont ministers is to follow the Tories because that's the deemed to be the sensible thing to do. So for all those reasons, we're saying that regardless of your if you hold a British passport, an Irish passport, a different passport, or whether you're Northern Irish, which is a growing kind of concept in the north. Fundamentally, it's about democratic decisions, and I think it's completely undemocratic for people in Scotland to be dictated to by London in terms of what they can and cannot do, in terms of decisions they can make, laws they can pass or not. And I note there's a move to kind of block laws in Holyrood, I think, over recent weeks. So the same applies to the north. People in the north, people in Belfast, Derry, Coleraine, right across, should be able to decide their own future, make their own decisions about tax, about foreign policy, around all these other issues, and not be dictated to by a out of touch elite in London. So we're trying to insert that class dynamic to the question of United Ireland, because it's still presented as, if you're a nationalist, if you live in a nationalist area, you will, and you have to sort of, vote for United Ireland, and you always will, no matter what. If you're a unionist and from a unionist area, you will always vote to oppose United Ireland and to remain within the UK. And things aren't as simple as that. Things are much more fluid than that. And Brexit has kind of thrown things up in the air. And I think as much as things in recent time, the recent weeks are quite difficult for people, we think there's massive opportunities to not only end partition in the period ahead, but also reshape politics on the island of Ireland. And we're trying to see the combination together, rather than seeing solely United Ireland first and then becomes the social change afterwards. We're trying to fuse the two together in the type of approach that James Connolly had more than 100 years ago.
I wanted to ask about that because people before profit, you're obviously you're pro the reunification of Ireland, but you're taking a class political approach to that. And in that sense, I mean, there are massive differences between Ireland and Scotland in this regard. I could talk to you for hours about the history, which I find fascinating. One of the only times that I can remember that the SNP leadership have ever referred to Ireland is something which is universally ignored in Scotland. It's too hot a potato. One of the only times they ever mentioned the historical experience of Ireland was when the SNP leadership said that they are very conservative plans for an immediate post-independence Scotland would reflect the Irish Free State, which I thought was a very strange, admission, and also quite telling, because conditions for the working class in the Irish Free State were not good. But in both of these situations, extremely different though they are, we are talking about, I mean, it's been very interesting for me to watch People Before Profit and that attempt, that fight to push, to drive class politics into the national question and to give it that central place where it belongs. It's also something we've struggled with in Scotland, which is to try and take it away from a purely nationalistic orientation and inject what I think the real class political backdrop to the Scottish national question is, and certainly is in the case of Ireland. I mean, you've had some successes in doing that. I mean, how do you think it's achieved? How do you create that niche for class politics? And what until quite recently, historically recently, was quite a frozen communitarian politics, and that's even institutionally baked in by Good Friday and stuff. How were you able to fight a class political corner in that?
On the issue of United Ireland in particular, David, yeah. Well, it isn't always easy or straightforward, to be completely frank with you. But that's the nature of politics in the north. But from our perspective, really, historically, it's been presented as maybe before Brexit, that the border was kind of resolved, it was sorted, and it will be looked at some point down the line. And obviously Brexit kind of threw everything up in the air. And from our perspective, in terms of the issue of class, it's really it's trying to cut against that narrative of mainstream Irish nationalism, or some elements of mainstream republicanism, which basically points to the need for demographic change. So once we get a certain amount of Catholics or nationalists, whatever terminology you want to use, then we will have a reason and a cause and a basis for a yes vote, which there's a certain logic numerically to that, but I think that's problematic for all sorts of reasons, because I think you have to at least appeal to people that getting rid of the border is not just an end in and of itself. And from our perspective, we want to get rid of the border not only because it was a historically regressive and reactionary move, which it was, but it's part of that process of really turning over the apple cart north and south. It's about saying, listen, working class people, as you said, have been failed in quote the Free State than we failed in the Northern State by historically unionism, but obviously by by unionism and nationalism and liberalism. If you want to talk about the Alliance Party, in terms of the last 20 years or so, so we have to combine those things together rather than seeing it just as we're for us kind of simply saying we're for a yes vote. We'll do that, and we'll go home at the end of the day. It's to try to say and try to work out how do we connect all those issues like abortion rights, equal marriage, climate reform, climate change, and making sure governments, north and south, tackle those issues fundamentally. How do we connect that with the question of United Ireland? Because historically, they're not seen as connected. Historically, the anti-racist struggle is not seen as part and parcel of the issue of getting rid of the border. And we're obviously involved in different campaigns around abortion rights, north and south, around a 32-county All Ireland, the NHS, around linking anti-racist struggles, north and south. So we do that in a organic or a natural way, if you want to put it like that. But we're trying to say, we're trying to articulate that part of the campaign for United Ireland has to reflect people who are often kept out of the debate, and not just keep it to centrists or middle of the road, nationalists of either hue. And we have to combine those, issues of social change with and inject it directly in the debate for a United Ireland. And I don't think that's abstract. We're trying to do that, like I said, this weekend with a conference for an alternative United Ireland, to try and pull activists together through different campaigns internationally, locally, around environmental questions and other topics. But it's to try and bring that class dynamic to it, and also to recognise that the Southern establishment do not want to see, certainly now and certainly in the medium term, United Ireland. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are quite their leadership, the Taoiseach and ministers are saying are basically sound quite similar to the DUP when it comes to a border poll. And United Ireland are basically saying now it's not the time, we have to wait. So the establishment in the South know that the possibility of United Ireland would threaten their or could threaten their position, their class interests, their cosy connections with the wealthy. And for us, it's to shout loud about that, but also to say to people, who are living in, traditionally working class unionist areas, who are brought up to say that, the British state has brought stability, it's brought the NHS, and it's brought all these things. We want to improve their conditions in a real transformative way. That means obviously tackling the wealth inequality, tackling the tax dodge in north and south. Well, in a greater way maybe in the south and the north, but tackle all these issues. So unless you have a program or an idea or slogans that kind of speaks to those desires of working class people on both sides, then I think it's not a foregone conclusion that even people in nationalist areas in the north will automatically vote for a border poll. So I think it's to try and tie those issues together.
Lots of interesting perspectives there for our viewers and listeners. Gerry, thanks very much for joining us on here today.
Thank you.
And viewers can see more videos like this by subscribing to the YouTube channel or to our SoundCloud, and go to conter.co.uk to read articles about Scotland, indeed about Ireland, about class politics more generally. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Fantastic. Thank you.
Is that okay, David?